although, as I showed before, this happened way back in '84 with TRW and Sears, with misused credentials. What happened was, the bad guy got they got from one Ford outlet, they managed to get the credential to do the credit checks over at Experian. Because, you know, when you go to buy a car, the first thing they do is they check your credit, and then they key your old car, or whatever else they do to try and cheer. And I thought sleeping car dealers would be through with that by now. Everybody, never mind. So, I had a bad experience here recently, traumatic. What happened was they got the credentials, they logged into TRW, and they yanked, I think it was 13,000, I can barely read my own slides with the lights here, 13,000 full credit reports. Now this is what was the cool part. These were not your everyday idiot bad guys. Because what they did is they sorted them by zip code. Anybody know why? People with a lot of money like to live around other people with a lot of money. And so based on the zip code, they categorized them, they did some bulk pulling of reports, they categorized them by zip code, and then they knew the areas that tended to be wealthier, and then they targeted those people for identity theft. And apparently it actually paid off for them. So they were eventually caught in that case, if I remember properly, and they got the fraud and they traced it back to those credentials back and forth at that period of time. So if we zoom forward a little bit, there's something I always like to say, that there's two groups of people you don't want to piss off in general. One of them is military veterans, okay? Because we know they don't have a sheet. The other is, and they are organized. You don't have to take it. I'm just kidding, but you don't, generally a group you don't want to upset. And then the other is politicians. We'll get back to them later. So in this case, TriWest Healthcare, they lost 562 veteran Social Security numbers. The main reason I should talk about this one still, this was a lost computer. So not just a specific hard drive or a laptop, I think it was a lost or stolen desktop that came out of that. Never been any fraud tied back to this. Never. These guys still all have credit on there. My father-in-law is a retired colonel from the Army. He still holds a grudge against TriWest for this particular case. Because when he got his notification and that went out, he got pretty upset about the thing. I mean, you know, if you think you're financially secure and you get one of these notices in the mail, and particularly when this happened, which was back in 2003, before we all got like a dozen of these things in the mail daily, you know, it's pretty upsetting. So he still holds a grudge. And anytime I talk about this stuff, the TriWest case comes out. And now they're angry with him because of, for other reasons. But mostly dealing with the fact that we don't want veterans health care in this country anymore. So, moving on, a little one, ISM Canada. So ISM was a small, or a relatively small consulting organization. They did outsourcing and those sorts of things up in Canada that IBM bought. Lost hard drive with hundreds of thousands of records from multiple Canadian government agencies. The reason this one is kind of big deal, this is another personal one. So I have a map there, and one of those little dots is Regina, Kansas. Regina, Saskatchewan, up in Canada. They have our Canadian folks, let's take Lewis. Those guys, they should be here for this. So, aside from being tragically easy to mispronounce, Regina is not the warmest place on the face of the planet. And we were up there, I was with Gardner doing a speaking engagement, and everybody freaked out. There's security people up in Regina, and the biggest scandal they did, I mean, this was a massive scandal within the Canadian government, that these hundreds of thousands of citizens' records were lost. It was lost because a hard drive disappeared. They thought it was stolen. All these terrible things were going to happen. We're up there talking about data security issues. I've covered that for many years now. Anybody remember, anybody have a guess about where that hard drive ended up? It's a really classic case, and I bet all of you would know it. Not get drunk with your prototype iPhone on a bar stool. But it was a sysadmin. They were taking a system out of service. They were decommissioning it. He took the hard drive home, wiped it, put it in one of his own computers. That is this. I mean, there were hearings with parliamentary procedures and all sorts of other stuff going on. Some guy just took the hard drive. We didn't know this at the time. This came out way later. That's what's cool about doing this presentation too. A lot of these breaches, years later, you often get the story. Just took the hard drive home and he wiped it. There was no stolen data. Still a breach disclosure. Still a pretty big deal. And the casino up there is like pathetic. California MP 1386 operative. This is in July of 2003. We've all heard of this. Anybody not heard of this? I actually have to check sometimes to talk to non-security audiences. So July 1st, 2003 is when it officially went into effect. And it was when it was officially ignored. You have a look at the breach numbers, which we're going to later. There are almost no breach disclosures between 2003 and 2005. Anybody know why? Nobody understood it. Nobody knew what the consequences were. I saw a thing yesterday, or might have been yesterday recently. A particular security vendor released a study they had done with QSAs for PCI compliance about what they thought the next things to be in the regulation was. That is the worst of snake oil, in my book. Because what they're trying to do is scare you to buying products for regulations that don't exist yet. What happens with the regulations, once some sort of regulation is passed, it doesn't matter. Because there's no enforcement mechanism, there's no enforcement agency, there's no active enforcement when it first comes out. So, to be honest, there's no reason to change practices at that given point in time for the most part. It's only when somebody is made responsible and accountable for enforcing that, when they put the enforcement mechanism in place. And then when we start to see enforcement, that usually changes behavior among organizations. That's what I call the compliance cycle. That's the reality of it. With 1386, nobody really had any answers. So lawyers, anytime anything came up, they were like, well, we don't know if we need to do anything about this or not, because there's no, it says you have to disclose this stuff, but nobody was in charge of enforcing it. There's no complaint mechanism that was built into the law. The usual screw-ups that happen with legislation. So we'll get back to 1386. Now, what's interesting, though, is by making a disclosure law, as opposed to a thou shalt secure your stuff law, it's basically the public blogging version of how to fix things. Now, in some ways, this is good, because companies really don't want to end up in the headline. For example, HIPAA has been mostly ignored. No disclosure law component has not been, until the HITECH Act recently was passed. My wife works in the hospital system. I'm not allowed to talk about that, so anybody here who's never mentioned that I mentioned her in a presentation, or she will stop putting up with me. And it was only when the HITECH Act notifications went out that they had to do breach disclosures that their head of IT started saying notices out. We do not want to end up on this list that the Health and Human Services is keeping of everybody who's using breach. So now for the first time the whole time she's worked there 10 years, they're starting to focus on security because of that. So public blogging works. Now the bad part about this is even if there's no fraud, the businesses suffer the disclosure. There's direct costs associated with disclosure. I don't want to go into the BS reputation costs because I don't think you can calculate any of that stuff. So, get back to the timeline here. And if we zoom forward a little bit, we finally started hitting our first breach here with Choice Point. And Choice Point, it turns out, was the first 1386 disclosure, and it was in 2005, so it was about 2 years later. I looked around a lot. I spent a serious amount of time trying to figure out what the first 1386 disclosure was, and it was incredibly difficult. Everybody thinks Choice Point was the first one where they specifically cited it. There may have been a case at San Diego State University where there was it was the usual university hack, and something happened there, but that's the best we can come up with, that I've been able to come up with. So we think this is the first big one. And it's kind of interesting in terms of the timeline. So there's a separate timeline here actually just for this one. So let's just remember July 1st, 2003, we talked about that before. It's going to come back into play. First day, 1386 occurred. And in terms of the anatomy of the breach, unusual activity was detected on 50 of their small business accounts. So remember I mentioned that Ford Motor Credit Company thing where they logged in? This is pretty much what happened here. Except what they found out was that those 50 accounts were created basically created only to perpetuate this fraud. Now, what does Choice Point do as a company? They're the company that other companies go to find out if the business or a person is legitimate. And they were not doing checks on their own customers to find out if their customers were legitimate. And they were allowing them access to, has anybody by the way seen the data that Choice Point has on you? You would need to change your pants. Not only do they have all of your credit stuff, all of your financial stuff, anything that's not covered by any privacy regulation, they have all the public database stuff. You ever get married, divorced, buy a house, sell a house, ever have a court proceeding, anything anywhere they have on you,